My husband spent 3 years mocking me for being lazy, never realizing that my silent, stationary hours were spent building a secret empire and a trap he'd never see coming. Today, he brought his mistress home to gloat, but he had no idea he was walking straight into his own arrest. My husband, Mark, has this infuriating habit of sighing whenever he walks through the door. It's not a tired sigh, it's a performance. He drops his keys on the entryway table with a sharp clack, hangs his coat with deliberate sluggishness, and then stands in the middle of our living room, waiting for me to emerge from the kitchen. When I finally do, usually wiping flour or grease from my apron, he looks at the untouched dishes in the sink or the laundry basket waiting to be folded, and his eyes narrow. "God, Sarah," he'll mutter, shaking his head. "I work 10 hours a day. I come home, and the place is a wreck. Do you ever just get up? Or are you planning on staying horizontal until I'm forced to carry you out of here? I swear, I've never met anyone as lazy as you." I used to cry. In the first year of our marriage, those words felt like a punch to the gut. I'd apologize, scramble to scrub the floors until my knuckles bled, and cook him a 5-course meal while my head throbbed. But that was 2 years ago. Now, I just watch him. I watch the way he assumes his life is the only one happening in this house, the way he views me as a glorified piece of furniture that occasionally malfunctions. He doesn't know that my day starts at 4 a.m., long before his alarm even thinks about ringing. He doesn't see the silent, calculated ballet I perform to keep our lives afloat while he sleeps in the warm cocoon of his own ego. He thinks I'm lazy because he only sees the version of me he's allowed to see, the one who exists to serve him. Little does he know, I've been keeping a tally. And today, I decided it was time for the final count. The morning of the breaking point started like any other. Mark left for his high-stakes consulting firm, grumbling about how he had to carry the entire department on his back while I dabbled in my hobbies. As soon as his Audi pulled out of the driveway, I didn't sit down. I didn't turn on the TV. I pulled my laptop from its hiding spot under the loose floorboard in the closet. I opened the dashboard of the small freelance empire I'd been building for 3 years, the one he thought was just me playing on my phone. My first job, the one he calls my little hobby, is a high-level copywriting and SEO management firm that handles 6-figure accounts. My second job, which I do via encrypted meetings while he thinks I'm napping, is as a remote consultant for an international logistics company, solving problems that would make his head spin. And my third, that's the one that's going to ruin him. I was finishing up a complex data migration for a client in London when my phone buzzed. It was a notification from my third job, the private investigation agency I'd been contracting for. They had finally sent over the files I had requested 3 weeks ago. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I clicked the attachment. I had spent months tracking his bank statements, his late-night business trips, and the strange, expensive jewelry I'd found in his gym bag that certainly didn't belong to me. As the PDF loaded, my screen glowed with the cold, hard proof of his double life. I wasn't just working 3 jobs to make ends meet. I was working them to fund the truth. Just as I clicked open the final folder, the front door handle jiggled. He was home early, and he wasn't alone. I scrambled to close the tabs, my breath hitching in my throat as I heard his voice, sharp and commanding, echoed by a soft, unfamiliar feminine giggle from the hallway. He wasn't supposed to be back for hours. I shoved the laptop under the sofa cushion and stood up, my pulse ringing in my ears. I walked toward the living room, my hands trembling as I realized the front door was wide open, and the silence that followed the giggle was heavy, expectant, and cruel. I stepped into the foyer and froze. There he stood, arm wrapped around a woman I recognized from his LinkedIn photos, looking at me with the same disgusted expression he always wore when he called me lazy. "See?" he said, gesturing toward me with a smug, condescending smile. I told you she's useless. She won't even know what to do. The woman beside him, draped in a silk coat that probably cost more than my first car, looked me up and down with the practiced detachment of someone inspecting a stained carpet. Mark didn't even bother to introduce her. He just kept that smug, tight-lipped expression, his fingers digging into her waist as if he were trying to claim territory. I told you, Elena, it's like living with a ghost, he said, his voice dripping with performative exhaustion. I come home, and the house is cold, the chores are undone, and Sarah is just existing, wasting space. I felt the heat rising in my neck, but I forced it down. I pushed the rage into a small, dark box in my mind and locked it shut. My training as a private investigator had taught me that the moment you lose your composure is the moment you lose the case. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice perfectly steady. I see you brought a guest, Mark. I wasn't aware we were hosting. Mark let out a sharp, mocking bark of laughter. We aren't hosting. Elena is an associate. She's here to go over the quarterly projections because, unlike some people, she actually contributes to the world. He turned to her, his tone shifting to something oily and charming. I'm sorry you have to see this. I've been trying to get her to be more productive for months, but she's just lazy. It's a chronic condition. Elena smirked, a cruel, thin line of a smile. Maybe if you gave her a list, Mark? Some people need structure to function. Oh, I've given her lists, Mark replied, walking past me as if I were a piece of furniture he was planning to throw out. She just ignores them, probably too busy staring at the walls. He walked into the kitchen, his heels clicking against the hardwood, and paused. He saw the island, usually clear, but currently covered in a stack of organized, color-coded files for my logistics project, as well as my second laptop, which I hadn't managed to hide in time. He stopped dead. What is all this trash? I followed him into the kitchen, my heart hammering a rhythm of pure adrenaline. That's not trash, Mark. That's work. He swiped his arm across the island, sending my files fluttering like confetti onto the floor. Work? You're playing with papers while I'm out there making the money that pays for this roof? He turned to face me, his face turning a dangerous, mottled red. I am tired of the lies, Sarah. I'm tired of the laziness. I think it's time we discuss what happens to people who don't pull their weight in a household like this. You're done. The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He thought he was firing me from his life, but he had no idea what he had just ignited. I bent down slowly, picking up a single page from the floor, a printout of the bank transfer records I'd uncovered from his consulting firm. It showed a recurring payment to an account registered to Elena's home address, labeled maintenance fee. I didn't stand up. I stayed on the floor, looking up at him, and realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. I was waiting. You want to talk about my contribution, Mark? I asked, my voice dangerously low. You want to talk about why I'm lazy? He scoffed, grabbing Elena by the hand. I don't have time for your delusions. We're going to the office. When we get back, I want your things packed and gone. I'm tired of looking at you. He turned to walk out, but I stood up then, blocking the doorway. I held the document out, not to show him, but to let him see the header, a legal seal from the state's Financial Crimes Division. His eyes flickered to the paper, and the color drained from his face so fast he looked like he was about to faint. His hand, which had been so firm on Elena's, began to shake. Wait, he stammered, his bravado shattering in an instant. Where did you get that? You said I was lazy, I whispered, stepping closer until I was inches from his chest. You have no idea how much I've been working while you were busy playing pretend. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, the screen recording active. I pressed a button, and the house filled with the crystal-clear audio of a phone conversation he'd had just last week, discussing offshore accounts and cleaning the books. The sound of his own voice confessing to fraud filled the room. Elena pulled her hand away from him, her face twisting in horror. Mark lunged for the phone, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. But before he could reach me, the front door burst open. Standing there weren't my friends or a delivery driver. It was two men in dark suits, badges hanging from their belts, their expressions grim and final. They didn't even look at me. They walked straight toward Mark, who had gone completely limp. "Mark Peterson?" one of the agents asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "We have a warrant for your arrest regarding the embezzlement case involving the logistics firm you claim to consult for." Mark spun around to look at me, his eyes wild, pleading, and murderous all at once. "You," he hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying realization. "You didn't just find out. You set this up. You were the one who filed the initial report." I didn't answer him. I just leaned against the doorframe, folded my arms, and watched as the agents pulled out their handcuffs. But as they closed the distance, the lead agent paused, his brow furrowing as he looked at the open laptop on the counter, then back at me. "Ma'am," he said, his tone shifting from professional to suspicious, "we're going to need you to explain exactly how you obtained access to these encrypted servers, and why there's a wire transfer of over $500,000 currently sitting in your personal account." The air in the kitchen turned glacial. The two federal agents didn't move toward Mark anymore. They turned their full predatory attention toward me. Mark, seeing the shift, let out a jagged, hysterical laugh. He was handcuffed now, his wrists locked behind his back, yet he managed to look at me with a twisted sense of triumph. "See?" he spat, his face pressed against the cool marble of the island as the agent held him down. "She's not the victim. She's the architect. She's been robbing me blind from the inside." I felt my heart sink. I had anticipated the audit, but I hadn't expected it to happen in my living room, in front of the man who had spent 3 years breaking my spirit. I looked at the lead agent, my mind racing. I had a defense, a perfectly documented trail of how I'd been hired by the company's internal security board to catch the thief who was actually stealing from them. But I couldn't explain that with Mark listening, and I certainly couldn't explain it while the woman he'd brought home, Elena, was staring at me with the eyes of someone who knew exactly how to twist a narrative. "I have the documentation," I said, my voice surprisingly steady given the chaos. "I am a contracted forensic investigator. I can show you the authorization from the firm's legal team." The lead agent, a man with tired eyes and a jaw like granite, didn't soften. "We'll look at your papers, ma'am. But right now, we're looking at a flagged account in your name that received a massive deposit from an offshore entity 3 hours ago. An entity linked directly to the embezzlement scheme we're investigating." "That's a setup," I hissed, glancing at Mark. He was grinning now, a raw, jagged look of malice. "She's a genius, isn't she?" Mark taunted, his voice rising in volume. "She plays the part of the lazy wife so perfectly, doesn't she? She's been bleeding me and them dry for months. She's the one you want, not me." I turned to the agent, desperate to keep my composure. "Check the timestamps on that transfer. Check the IP address of the sender. It wasn't me. It was routed through my private server to frame me. Someone knew I was investigating this." Elena, who had been deathly silent until now, stepped forward. She looked at the agents, her voice honeyed and rehearsed. "I'm sorry, officers, but I've seen her working on those projects for weeks. She was always bragging about how she found a way to bypass the company's security protocols. She even showed me a screen once. It looked exactly like the interface used to execute these transfers." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't just an associate. She was his accomplice, and they had clearly spent the last hour coordinating their story. They had turned my own diligence into a liability. "Ma'am, step away from the device," the agent commanded, his hand hovering over his holster. "I am the one who called you," I shouted, the frustration finally boiling over. "I am the one who gathered the evidence that brought you here. Check my browser history. Look at the encrypted file labeled case 001. It's all there. The agent signaled his partner. The second man stepped toward my laptop, his fingers hovering over the keys. I held my breath, knowing that my entire life, my hard work, my 3 jobs, my attempt to escape Mark, was about to be judged by 2 strangers who only saw a screen full of complicated numbers. The partner tapped a few keys, frowned, and then his expression darkened. "Sir, you need to see this." The lead agent stepped toward the counter, looking down at the screen. He turned back to me, his eyes now devoid of any professional courtesy. "Ma'am, there is no case 001. The drive is empty. It's been wiped clean within the last 60 seconds. I whipped my head toward the computer. The screen, which had been full of data mere moments ago, was now a blank, glowing blue box. I looked at Mark. He wasn't laughing anymore. He was staring at me with a look of pure, cold victory. And for the first time, I noticed his hand, the one that wasn't cuffed, was still holding a small black remote device tucked into his palm. He had remotely wiped my server the moment the agents arrived. "She's clearly tampering with evidence," Mark said calmly to the agents. "I think you'd better take her into custody before she deletes the rest of it." The agent took a step toward me, his handcuffs clicking as he reached for his belt. "Sarah, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice and suspected financial fraud. You have the right to remain silent." As he moved to grab my arm, I saw something in the reflection of the window behind the agents. A black SUV pulling into the driveway, and a man stepping out. It wasn't the police. It was the CEO of the company I had been working for, the only person who knew I was the one who had actually exposed the fraud. He wasn't looking at the agents, he was looking at me, and he had a folder in his hand that would either save me or bury me forever. The lead agent had his hand on my shoulder, his grip tightening as the cold metal of the handcuffs hovered inches from my wrists. Mark's smirk was so wide it looked painful, a portrait of narcissistic triumph. He thought he had won. He thought that by wiping my server, he had successfully transmuted his guilt into my downfall. Elena stood behind him, her arms folded, looking at me with the smug satisfaction of a spider that had watched a fly walk into its web. "Don't bother with the Miranda rights," Mark called out, his voice thick with malicious glee. "She's a tech-savvy criminal. She knows exactly what she's done. She wiped the evidence right in front of you." I didn't fight the officer. I didn't scream. I simply turned my head toward the front door, where the CEO, Mr. Sterling, was striding across the threshold with the heavy, purposeful gait of a man who owned the ground he walked on. He ignored the federal agents entirely, his gaze landing squarely on the laptop, the screen that Mark had so carefully scrubbed clean. "Officer," Sterling said, his voice resonant and commanding, stopping the room in its tracks. "Before you proceed, I suggest you check the physical backup hidden in the battery compartment of that laptop. The cloud might be wiped, but I assure you, my lead forensic consultant doesn't work without a physical hardline failsafe." The room went deathly silent. Mark's smirk flickered, his eyes darting toward the laptop as if he could see through the casing. The agent holding me paused, frowning. He looked at Sterling, then at the laptop, and finally at me. "Is this true?" "Check it," I whispered, my voice steady for the first time all day. The second agent pried open the base of the laptop. Within seconds, he pulled out a small, encrypted drive, the one I had installed only this morning, anticipating Mark's desperate, last-minute interference. He plugged it into his own handheld device. The blue screen on my laptop vanished, replaced by a wall of scrolling green text. "Sir," the agent said, his voice dropping to a whisper as he read the logs. "This contains a complete time-stamped mirror of the server. Every transfer, every email, every conversation between Mr. Peterson and Ms. Elena, it's all here. And look at the metadata. The transfers were initiated from a burner phone inside the Peterson residence, not from this machine." Mark went pale, his knees buckling until the agents had to hold him up by his elbows. That's impossible, he stammered, his bravado liquefying into pure terror. I wiped it. I wiped the drive. You wiped the client-side cache, Mark, I said, finally stepping out from the agent's reach. I walked over to the island and looked him in the eye, the man who had called me lazy for 3 years while I was silently dismantling his entire criminal enterprise. You never understood what I did for a living, did you? You thought I was lazy because you couldn't see the work. But the truth is, I've been outworking you since the day we met. I didn't just expose your fraud. I tracked every single penny you stole to fund your little life on the side. The lead agent snapped the cuffs onto Mark's other wrist, pinning him securely. Elena, seeing the shift in gravity, tried to back toward the door, but the CEO blocked her path. Ms. Elena, Sterling said, his voice like ice, I believe your involvement in the logistical embezzlement will be a matter of significant interest to these gentlemen as well. As they hauled Mark out of the house, he didn't look at me with anger anymore. He looked at me with a confused, hollow bewilderment. He couldn't comprehend how the lazy wife he had patronized and belittled had become the architect of his total ruin. He shouted something about how I was a monster, how I had set him up, but his voice was swallowed by the closing doors of the police cruiser. Once they were gone, the house felt cavernous. Sterling looked at me, his expression softening into one of genuine respect. You handled that with remarkable restraint, Sarah. Most people would have let their anger dictate the process. You stayed cold. You stayed focused. I had a lot of practice, I said, glancing at the pile of papers Mark had swiped off the counter. The life I had been forced to live in secret. He thought the silence was laziness. He never realized it was the sound of a trap being set. Sterling nodded and headed for the door. Take the week off. You've earned it. I stood in the foyer, the silence of the house finally feeling like peace instead of a cage. I walked over to the kitchen island, picked up the coffee mug Mark had left there, and dumped the cold, bitter dregs into the sink. I didn't bother cleaning up the mess he'd made of my papers. I didn't need to. I walked to the closet, grabbed my bag, and walked out the front door, leaving the house, the memories, and the label of lazy behind. I had a 4th job to start on Monday, and for the first time in years, I was going to do it for myself.